Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Are You Ready to Garden? It's my pleasure to have everyone join us tonight. We've got an exciting speaker tonight with us. I just want to mention also that we have our Master Gardener program starting up this September again, and we're fortunate to be back with the Master Gardener program, to have everybody back in the classroom. So if you're interested in that, please get in touch with the email you see in front of you, mastergardeners@co.middlesex.nj.us, or you can call 732-398-5278. We also have a beginner farmer program called Are You Ready to Farm? So if you're interested, let us know and we'll get you into the next round of classes. Well, tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Adam D'Angelo. Adam is a graduate student studying plant breeding and plant genetics at the University of Wisconsin, Madison's Department of Horticulture. Adam is targeting his research on root crops and will share fascinating information for gardeners of all levels. Adam is actually a graduate of Rutgers University School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. We also called Cook College back when I was at Rutgers, and also a proud member of Hellier House, the cooperative living group at Rutgers University. And he is out doing his research at the University of Wisconsin. And today he's going to take you a journey through the past, present, and future of root crops in the home garden. And he's going to show you how to grow these root crops. And he's going to give us some exciting peeks at the new vegetable varieties being released from University of Wisconsin-Madison, including carrot, onion, and his beet breeding program. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce Adam D'Angelo. Adam, you are on, and welcome back to New Jersey.
Hi, folks. Thank you for the wonderful intro, Bill. This presentation is going to be focused on getting back to our roots with root crops. Who is this guy? My name's Adam. I'm a graduate from Rutgers. I studied plant biology and agriculture and food systems. I also worked with hazelnuts while I was there at the Rutgers Hazelnut Breeding Program, and that gave me a great foundation into learning plant genetics and plant breeding, and I was able to take what I learned at Rutgers and apply to graduate programs and ended up here at the University of Wisconsin, where I study the genetics behind flavor and eating quality in table beets, Beta vulgaris. But more on that in a bit. The overall plan for our night here is we're going to have a brief overview of how you choose crop varieties and even the crops you're going to grow in your garden. I'll give you a brief introduction to various root crops and how they're grown, how they're used, a little bit of their history. I'll explain the research going on in my lab here at the University of Wisconsin. I'll give you an exclusive tour into the new vegetable varieties being released from Wisconsin, which is something that not very many people get. And lastly, I'll take some questions and hopefully I'll have some good answers for you. The overall theme of gardening and of pretty much everything in life is to not waste your time. Your time is important. You're very busy people. And while gardening is a fun and relaxing hobby, there are some things you can do to make it a little bit more worth your time. And what I mean by that is in the crops you choose to grow. Overall, overarching themes through this are you would like to avoid crops that are cheap or easily available, and you want to avoid sprawling or low yielding crops. That's specifically if you have a limited amount of space, a limited amount of time. So you'll see I have pictures of things like wheat and corn and cotton. And while they're very important crop plants, for most home gardeners, it does not make sense to be growing low value, high volume things like that. You can buy a package of flour very cheap at the store. Products made with corn are cheap, and even sweet corn is tough to really justify growing on a very small scale because it takes so much time and resources to produce and so much space in your small garden. Instead, I like to focus on things that are maybe very expensive at the store or they're hard to get. So for example, heirloom tomatoes, things like that, they can fetch a pretty good price at the supermarket. You can also grow higher quality produce. So maybe it's a variety that is sold in the supermarket, but if you grow it fresh in your garden, it's even higher quality. It tastes better, it looks better, it lasts longer. And of course, having fun. So maybe you decide that you really do want to grow corn or wheat or cotton. And then in that case, you totally should. Gardening is all about finding out what you want and exploring those desires. You can see in the pictures here, I've got a wide variety of heirloom tomatoes. On the right, we've got Mexican sour gherkin cucumbers, which are very small cucumbers, nice and sour. And on the bottom, we've got loofah gourds, which is something you can use in the shower to wash yourself. And those are just fun crops. So what I'm trying to say here is, we'll go back. What I'm trying to say is that when you're choosing root crops, you should really focus on the unique varieties. This talk isn't going to talk about what varieties you should grow. It's going to talk about different crops you can grow. And if you're interested in one of them, then I highly suggest you go look at a seed catalog or go onto a seed company website and look through all their varieties, because for every single plant, there are hundreds or sometimes thousands of different varieties you can grow. And some of them look really fun and they taste great too. Some general considerations when we're growing root crops. Everything I'm going to show you today wants full sun. Root crops in general love full sun and they love deep, fertile soil. Specifically, they like deep tilled soil. So if you have nice soil, it does help to till it, or at least to take your pitchfork or your shovel in there and fluff it up a little bit so that the roots have space to grow down into the soil. Growing root crops is not hard. It's an ancient activity. It's one of humanity's oldest agricultural pursuits. We've been eating and growing root crops for almost as long as we've had agriculture. So you can totally do this. Every one of you can grow root crops very easily, but you probably won't break any records. It's extremely easy to grow root crops well. It's pretty hard to grow them very well. So once again, just focus on having a good time, enjoying what you're doing, and learning a bit about the process. When you're growing crops, pretty much any crop in the garden, some helpful tips are to tackle weeds early and often. It's much easier to take out a weed infestation while they're very small, not deeply rooted, and before they set seed. You should allow the soil to dry between waterings, but don't let plants wilt. I've found that the number one killer of plants is too much love, especially plants in containers. If you overwater them, they do not enjoy that. You should apply fertilizer as appropriate. Too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So if you see plants starting to yellow or look like they're in need of nutrients, you should apply a moderate or the recommended amount of fertilizer. And lastly, follow the instructions. There are a ton of resources online for how to grow specific plants, how to grow plants in general, and even the seed packets that you're going to be getting for a lot of these varieties have instructions on how you should care for your plants. Inevitably, when you start growing your root crops, some of your plants will get diseases. The best offense is a good defense. Weak plants are very susceptible to diseases and pests. So what you can do is make sure that you have very strong plants. Take good care of them. Keep them weeded, keep them watered, keep them healthy and happy so that they can fight off any diseases or pests. You can grow disease-resistant varieties. If you know that every year your potatoes end up getting potato blight, you can try and find varieties that are resistant to that. It's normally listed in the seed catalogs or on the packets. You should water in the morning. Fungal diseases, such as the mildews, they rely on 8 hours of consecutive moisture for the fungal spores to penetrate the leaf. So if you water in the evenings, while it may seem like it makes sense because the plant's dried out during the day, what you're allowing though to happen is the water will sit on the leaves overnight, and the fungal spores that may have landed on the leaves during the day will be able to penetrate the leaves, and that's how you're going to get a fungal infection. So always water in the morning if you can. When it comes to pests, if you're growing outside, a lot of infestations will take care of themselves. If you have aphids, natural predators from surrounding yards or the woods or borders may come in and deal with those pests. There's sort of a natural equilibrium that happens. If you're growing a ton of the same plant, you may find that it doesn't take care of itself. Maybe the pests just do really well on that crop, which is why it's important to grow a wide variety of crops and to grow them in a way that keeps them healthy and happy. And finally, if you do see plants that are diseased or dying, you're going to want to remove that material as soon as possible. If you remove that material, it has less of a chance of spreading whatever disease that is to other crops. And with that, we're going to jump into our overview of various root crops. So first, we have radishes. Radishes have a near and dear place to my heart because they're one of the first things that I used to grow when I was young and getting into gardening. In fact, I recommend that everyone, if you're just starting to explore gardening or just starting to explore root crops, you should grow some radishes. They're the easiest and fastest root crop to grow. They typically can take just a month to go from seed to something ready to eat. In some cases, it can even be faster depending on your growing conditions. They're great on salads. They're good in stir fries. Plus, you can plant them right now. The reason for that is radishes are cool weather crops. They don't really enjoy the heat of the summer. They enjoy the border season. So you can either plant them in the spring or you can plant them towards the end of the growing season and they'll grow through the fall. You're going to plant your seeds in a row and thin them to a 3-inch spacing. And an important consideration is that you should water them moderately, especially when they're big and swollen. If you water them too much, you do run the risk of the roots swelling up with water and cracking. When they are round and they look like they are your typical radish, you can go ahead and pull them out, cut the tops off, and store them in the fridge until you're ready to use them. So radishes are a great option for people who are just starting to get into it, and maybe you haven't grown very many root vegetables. When I talk about root vegetables, a lot of people, the first thing they think of is potatoes, and that makes sense because potatoes are a very important crop. You can see here I've got some cool purple potatoes, and that's one of the advantages of being able to grow unique varieties on your own, is that you can really start to explore some cool things. So potatoes are filling and versatile. You can make a ton of meals with them. They're relatively good for you. I think they're almost a nutritionally complete food. But some things, there's a ton of diversity. Potatoes are a treasure trove of plant diversity, full of flavors and colors and shapes that are totally unique. So if you're going to grow potatoes in your garden, you could avoid the russets. The russet Burbank is a great potato. It grows very well, but I encourage people to really branch out because if you go to the supermarket, you can buy 5 pounds of russet potatoes for $3. So it's not really worth your space in the garden if you can just get that very easily. But if you're to go to the supermarket and try and buy some of these heirloom potato varieties, they're either not available or they're kind of expensive. Potatoes do have a tendency to be susceptible to pests and diseases. So that's something you'll have to watch. And as I said, with proper care, you can try and minimize that, but ultimately you will want to select varieties that are disease resistant. When you go to grow potatoes, you get seed potatoes and you cut them. Well, first of all, the seed potato is a potato. And you've seen the little buds all over your spuds, and those will eventually grow. Maybe you've left your potato in the pantry for a little bit too long and you've seen it start to sprout. Well, that's exactly how we plant potatoes. We don't plant them from seed. If you'd like to maximize the number of potatoes you get from your seed potato, you can cut the seed potato up into little chunks so that each potato chunk has an eye. You plant that potato chunk with the eye facing up into the ground, 2 to 3 inches deep, at 1 foot spacings between each other. They'll grow up through the soil, and as they grow, they'll put on their leaves, and you'll want to mound soil up around them so that they have more space to grow tubers underneath the soil surface. The mounded soil also helps you to prevent the potatoes from becoming green because when the sunlight hits potatoes, it causes a chemical reaction that turns the skin green, and we would like to avoid that. 10 weeks after you plant them, you can harvest new potatoes, which are those very small potatoes. And after the first frost in the fall, you can harvest your big mature potatoes. You're going to want to store them for 1 week at room temperature, and then you can take them down into a cool, dry place that's between 30 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's where you can store them long term. These ideas are different ways to grow potatoes. It's sometimes quite difficult to find soil that you can really dig deep, and you'll find that if you can't till your soil and get it fluffy, potatoes may have a hard time growing in them, and you may have a hard time harvesting them. The ideas here are using galvanized fencing with some straw to hold soil, or just doing straw bale gardening to grow the potatoes in. The picture in the middle is tire gardening, so that's where you fill each tire with soil, and then as the potato plant grows up, you add another tire on top, fill it in, and every section of stem that is buried will turn into roots, which will in turn produce more potatoes. And then some people have success with the bags you see on the right, which are just large fabric bags that you fill with soil, and that will let you grow potatoes on your patio or your porch or something. In the same category as potatoes are sweet potatoes. Here we've got three very cool looking varieties of sweet potato. Your traditional orange one, we've got one with purple flesh and white skin, and one with white skin and purple flesh. Sweet potatoes are a very fun crop. They're healthy and they're tasty and they're pretty too. There's even ornamental varieties of sweet potatoes that form nice flowers, or they have deep purple foliage that can look really nice if you're trying to do some edible landscaping. One thing to consider is that the vines can be sprawling, especially if you're growing a variety that's known for its vigorous tuber production. It usually also produces a lot of leaves. So if you don't have a lot of space, or you're growing other plants that can't be crowded out, sweet potatoes might not be the best for you. You can expect yields of about 2 to 4 pounds per plant, but keep in mind, if you were just going to grow the normal orange sweet potatoes, you can buy those for about $1 a pound at the supermarket. So maybe consider growing some of those cool purple ones or the white fleshed ones. Sweet potatoes are fun because you can start them from slips. So just like potatoes, sweet potatoes have eyes on them, and they'll start to sprout if you store them in the right conditions. And we'll get into how you can actually start your slips in a little bit. But when you order sweet potato slips from a seed company, they'll ship you what you see on the left there, which is just a rooted stem essentially, and you can poke that into the soil after the danger of frost, and it should take right off. You're going to water them often throughout the growing season to keep the plants healthy, but you're going to stop watering them about 2 weeks before you're ready to harvest. So you're going to try and harvest them right after the first frost. It takes about 100 to 120 days, which is kind of tight sometimes for New Jersey, to grow a really good crop of sweet potatoes. I know in South Jersey they do that, but up in North Jersey, sometimes you can have trouble hitting that mark. Once you do harvest your sweet potatoes, just like regular potatoes, you're going to store them at room temperature for a week, and then you're going to take them down to 55 degrees and keep them out of direct sunlight. A good place for them is your basement, or maybe you've heard it called a root cellar, and that kind of makes sense because it's the right temperature and conditions to store roots in long term. If you decide, if you got a really cool sweet potato variety and you decide that you don't want to buy it again next year, the great thing about this is that you can save that variety over winter. When you harvest your potatoes in March, you can pick out the smaller ones from your harvested potatoes. Make sure that they don't have any diseases. They're not from plants that were very sick or very ill, and they're from plants that seem to produce well. You're going to store those in March. After you store them over the winter, you'll take them out and put them in paper bags, and you'll store them in a warm, humid place. And just like potatoes, they'll start to sprout. Those sprouts, when they get to be 3 to 6 inches long, you can just pull them off of the sweet potato and place them in a jar of water, and they'll grow roots. And that's how you'll get your slips for the next year. So that's one of the great things about growing cool varieties of sweet potatoes is not only do you get a bunch of tasty and unique sweet potatoes, is that each year you can give these slips to your neighbors and friends, and you can sort of spread that wealth you've accumulated. When I talk about sweet potatoes, a lot of people think yams because we've sort of conflated the two here in the United States. Sweet potatoes and yams are different. Yams are actually in the same family as lilies, so they're very different from sweet potatoes, and you can't, I think you'd have a very hard time growing them in New Jersey because they need a subtropical or extremely warm climate, and they'll often take a full year to actually produce a good sized yield of yams. So that's just to clear up a little bit of confusion. We're talking about growing sweet potatoes, not yams. Our next crop is carrots. You can see here just a little bit of the wide wealth of diversity in carrot color and pigmentation, from deep purple to a dark red to your classic orange to yellow and even white. You know, carrots are just something that you can really paint with the pigments. So carrots, as you may be aware, are tasty and crunchy. They're high in vitamins and nutrients, and they're pretty cheap. If you see the baby carrots here in this picture, that is not a type of carrot. That is just a way that we've processed the carrot. So the actual carrot, while it's generally that shape, is taken to a facility where it's then ground down. The skin is removed and it's peeled, and that's where our baby carrots come from. And then the rest of the carrot goes into things like carrot cake filling and things like that, or carrot juice. Carrots thrive in deep, well-drained soil, which is something that I always had trouble with in North Jersey, where I'm from, because we tend to grow rocks there instead of carrots. So it's pretty hard to actually grow a straight carrot, which is why you can do things like growing them in containers, or raised beds are a great option if you don't have great topsoil. But luckily in New Jersey, a lot of us have really good soil to work with. So if that's the case, you can plant your carrots in the spring. In our breeding program out here, we started planting our carrots 2 weeks ago. We went out and we planted the seeds, and we'll let them come up. And when they do come up, we'll thin them to the correct density, and then we'll allow them to grow through the season. The reason I didn't give you a number for how to thin them is that the thinning actually is determined by the shape of the carrot. There's lots of different shapes of carrots. They're all roughly the same pointed, but some of them, especially ones that are very thin, have to be grown at a very high density to make the roots grow straight down. So I would generally follow the instructions that are on the back of your seed packet for your carrots. An important thing for carrots and for any crop is to know your garden. Sometimes we find ourselves in the unfortunate situation of having something like a root knot nematode problem in our garden. Root knot nematodes and nematodes in general are very small, non-segmented roundworms, and they live in the soil. In the case of a root knot nematode, they feed on the developing tissue of the roots, and they cause intense damage, which can cause a hormonal response, which makes you get very weird carrots like this. If you're also wondering why your carrots keep coming out weird, maybe you just have really rocky soil, or maybe you have heavy clay soil or something else going on. If you're not really trying to get into the weeds and figure out what it is, a general rule of thumb is to avoid areas that have had disease problems in the past. If you notice your carrots and other crops have characteristic symptoms like this each year, try to not plant carrots there. Try to plant something from a different plant family. And the same goes for things like potatoes. If your potatoes get a blight every year, don't plant potatoes there anymore. That's why crop rotations are important. And the longer you can go between cycles of planting the same plant in an area, generally the better. I see a question in the chat there. Parsnips are related to carrots, yeah, to some degree. And we can actually get into that a little bit later when we talk about our carrot breeding program. Next, we're going to talk about onions. Now, onions are something near and dear to my heart, but they're actually something near and dear to most people's hearts. They originated in Pakistan, and they're one of the most consumed vegetables in all of the world. Lots of cultures have onions just as an integral part of their meal. There's wild onion relatives present all over the planet, and each culture that is exposed to these varieties tends to use them in their dishes either as a spice or as a main ingredient. You may have noticed that I have a theme here. When vegetables are cheap to buy, I don't generally advise that you go out and grow them unless you're going to grow a really cool variety. If you don't have a lot of space, something that I would say you could consider growing would be bunching onions. Bunching onions are cool because they don't take up quite as much space, because you can harvest the bulbs or the leaves and use them just like you would scallions or chives. You can cut them up and use them in your stir fries, or you can grill them up if you want. Some bunching onions can even be perennials, which is cool because you can just harvest the leaves year after year, and you can divide them and spread them, and you'll have a cool sort of regenerative system present in your garden that's pretty low maintenance. If you're going to grow onions, you can do it two ways. You can plant onion seeds, or you can plant sets. In our growing program, we plant seeds for our breeding program, and we just planted our seeds 3 weeks ago. If you're planting sets, those are just very small onions. And over the course of the growing season, they'll put up leaves and they'll get bigger and they'll swell. Being that it's a little bit late to be planting your onion seeds, at least out here it is, you might want to consider putting some sets in the ground if you were dead set on growing onions. In New Jersey, you should typically grow a long day type onion. What that means is that there's different types. There's short day, medium day, and long day onions. And those are dependent upon the day length in the heat of summer, whether or not they're going to produce bulbs. So here in Wisconsin, since we're up high north in the latitude, we have short winter days and long summer days. So we have to choose a long day type onion so that it will produce bulbs in our climate. If you're down in the south, then you're going to be growing a short day onion because your summer days are a little bit shorter than they are up here. In New Jersey, you should be growing long day type onions, or medium if you're in South Jersey. One consideration when you're looking to fertilize your onions is to choose a nitrate-based fertilizer versus a sulfate-based. And that's because you may have noticed that some onions are very pungent. You cut into them and you cry, or your whole house smells like onions. And a lot of that has to do with the amount of sulfur that's present where they're growing. The famous Vidalia onion is really just an onion growing region in Vidalia, Georgia, where there's very low sulfur content in the soils, and they've got great soil for growing onions. So those onions are just naturally lower in those sulfite compounds, so they don't make you cry, and they're a little bit sweeter. That's pretty much because of how they're grown. If you were to apply a bunch of sulfate-based fertilizer, you might find that your onions start to be more pungent. You're going to harvest when the tops turn brown. You're going to pull them out of the ground, and you're going to let them dry down a little bit, and then you're going to store them between 35 and 55 degrees, and they'll store for a long time. I still have onions from last August, and they're still fine. I just kept them in my basement. Garlic is right in there with onions, but I love garlic as a garden crop because a little bit goes a long way. If you grow a couple rows of garlic, you can harvest that and dry it down and store it, and you'll have garlic all year round. You can give it to your neighbors. Plus, there's some really cool specialty varieties of garlic. I have some black garlic pictured here, and those just make great gifts, and they're also cool additions to your dinner. Since these are related to onions, we were talking about crop rotations before, so you're not going to want to follow up garlic right after onions, and vice versa, because when you do that, say your onions got some sort of disease, if you grew garlic there, the same diseases that affect onions often affect garlic and other members of alliums. So your bunching onions, your chives, those are all related. So those diseases oftentimes cross over. So you're going to want to make sure you follow your rotations and don't put the related species there year after year. In early spring, you're going to plant some cloves of garlic. One clove will send up a leaf, and it'll actually grow into a little garlic plant. You could also plant them in the fall. Out here, it's a little tough planting in the fall because it gets very cold. So we have to make sure that we mulch them so that they don't freeze over the winter. But one little clove of garlic will eventually grow into a whole bulb. And when the tops start to turn brown and wither and wilt down, you can go ahead and pull them out. You'll leave them to dry in a bright area, but not direct sunlight, for 2 weeks. And then you can take that, you can cut the tops off, and you can store them in a dry, cool, well-ventilated space until you're ready to use it. And now for something near and dear to my heart, we've got beets, Beta vulgaris, a very old vegetable. It originated in the Mediterranean. It originally was the wild beet is called Beta meridema, and it was just a little vegetable that had leaves that were pretty tasty, and people ate those. And eventually, we think as they started using beets to feed animals, they selected for a root structure that could be stored over the winter and then dug up and fed to the animals in the winter. So you wanted like a swollen carbohydrate root structure. Turns out when you have big swollen carbohydrate root structures, people like to eat those too, because that's what potatoes are, swollen carbohydrates. And beets quickly became an important food source, particularly for people in Eastern Europe. So the evolution of the modern day beet is a result of recurrent selection, people choosing the best tasting beets. And we've continued that here in our breeding program, which we'll talk about later today. Beets come in all sorts of colors, and they're really great because you can eat the roots, not east, and you can eat the shoots. Depending on the varieties, some of them have really good greens you can cut and saute with some butter and garlic, and the roots can be eaten in a whole wide variety of ways. Plus, they're easy to grow. And perhaps the best thing is that you still have time to plant yourself some beets. We're going to be planting our beets out here in 1 or 2 weeks. You can plant them all the way until June because they're a cool weather crop. You're going to want to plant them after the danger of frost has passed. You're going to want to plant them just like radishes or a lot of these other root crops. They're cool weather crops. So you're going to want to make sure you plant it either in spring or in fall. They're not going to do super great through the heat of summer. If you want to have yourself a nice steady supply of young tender beets, you can plant them every 2 weeks. And you can go ahead and you can plant them through the summer. It might be a little bit more challenging, but if you harvest them young, you'll have nice tender beets, and they'll usually taste a little bit sweeter. And after you harvest them, you're going to want to refrigerate them until you're ready to eat. A great way to eat beets is to roast them and then put them into a nice, this is like a beet goat cheese salad. Roasted beets on their own are great. And even some of the new beet varieties we're making can be eaten fresh. Planting density affects the size. If you're going for a canning beet and you want big round beets that you're going to cut up and boil and put in jars, then you're going to want to think of spacing your beets out more. If you would like small tender beets, or you're just going to grow them for the greens, you're going to plant them close together. Plant the plants you want. If you want pickling or canning beets, there's plenty of traditional beets like bull's blood or other big red canning beets. If you're looking for something that you can eat fresh, you might want to consider the University of Wisconsin's new release, Badger Flame. And we'll talk about why these are good to eat fresh and eat raw in a little bit. If you're looking to roast them, Boro F1 hybrids, an old classic. It's a nice, consistent, high-yielding beet. And if you're looking for greens, a cool heirloom variety is Lutz Greenleaf. One plant that I think often gets overlooked is horseradish. It's a cool root crop. It's a great gift for neighbors. It's a great way to really annoy anyone who is trying to be in the kitchen with you while you cook with it. And it's a great way to annoy anyone who doesn't want horseradish in their garden. So horseradish is a root that has very pungent taste, and you've probably had it as a condiment or something. One word to the wise is that it can be hard to eradicate, so make sure you like horseradish before you plant horseradish, and maybe plan on being okay with horseradish being in that area of the garden for a while. You're going to plant the roots in early spring. You're going to plant them on 18-inch spacing because they do kind of sprawl. You're going to want to manage the weeds really well because they're going to take a while to actually come up. The roots sort of grow under the soil for a bit, and then eventually they'll poke their heads up. So you're going to want to make sure you keep them well weeded, and you're going to want to make sure you don't accidentally pull your horseradish plants out while you're doing that. After the first frost, you can go ahead and dig your roots up. If you want to give your roots, if you want to have a big yield of horseradish, you cannot dig them up, and you can let them go for the first year, and then the second year they might be hotter, or they'll probably also multiply, and you'll have a lot of horseradish. But once you harvest it, you're going to store it in the refrigerator, and you can use the grated roots as a condiment. Lastly, we've just got a few more plant varieties. We're not going to cover them all that much. Turnips are another root crop, and they're a member of the Brassica family, so that's the same family as cabbage and cauliflower, broccoli, kale, mustard. So they actually have kind of a pungent mustard flavor to them. They're a cool weather crop, just like radishes, just like beets. What's cool is you can also eat these beets, turnip greens. You can saute them, and it's a pretty classic dish. And as long as you get those roots when they're young, they're still pretty sweet, and you can enjoy them roasted, or here I think they've sauteed them with the greens to make a nice addition to your summer vegetable dish. Rutabaga is another member of the Brassica family, just like turnips, and you can grow them and cook them pretty much the same way. A cool crop that you might want to grow and that I've always been fascinated with are peanuts. And I know I'm kind of going against myself because peanuts are incredibly cheap at the grocery store. The term comes to mind, buying something for peanuts. But they're kind of a cool novelty, and you can even grow them in a pot. They're legumes, so they fix nitrogen into the soil, just like beans or peas do, or clover. The nuts are not actually nuts, they're underground seed pods, and that's actually what you're going to plant, and we'll get to that in a second. They do need long, hot growing seasons, which is something that New Jersey doesn't always have. So if you're going to grow peanuts, there is a chance you won't get anything from them. But they do look kind of cool. They usually take 4 to 5 frost-free months, which I think you can get. I would start these inside and then transplant them. And the plants do vine, so they might take up some space. I think they're a pretty cool container plant. You're going to plant them in full sun, 4 to 6 inch spacing. You're going to thin them once they're up, if they're in a row, because the plants get kind of bushy and vining. You're going to water them consistently, and when the foliage starts to wilt in the fall or at the end of summer, you're going to harvest them. You'll dig them up, and you'll let the peanuts themselves dry. And the peanuts don't actually taste like much unless you roast them. So make sure after you let them dry, you go ahead and roast them in the oven. There's lots of recipes online, and you'll have your very own roasted peanuts. And it's just a cool novelty. One last crop is uluco, and that's something that I actually discovered out here because it's related to beets. It's in the same family, Caryophyllales, and it's a Peruvian tuber crop. They're a huge source of food in Peru, but they're not very well known up here in North America. And that may be because they're a little bit difficult to grow. If you remember me talking about onions, I talked about how day length can affect whether the onions actually produce bulbs. While these are different plants, a similar thing is happening. Day length is really influencing whether these crops actually produce tubers. I know there's someone in Washington that's able to get consistent production, but in other areas of the country, it hasn't really been tested. So we're not sure if you'll get any production, but I'd say take a chance, because if you look at the betalain pigments in that's such a pretty looking tuber, and it tastes a little bit earthy. It kind of has a slight beet flavor, but I think it's very unique, and I'm hoping to grow some this summer, and I'll let you know if they produce in Wisconsin. So what's next? We'll talk about the breeding program in a second. Out here at my lab at the University of Wisconsin, we are the Goldman Research Laboratory under Professor Erwin Goldman. We study carrots, onions, and beets. You've got 2 pictures of Erwin Goldman up there. On the left, you've got him with his Badger Flame beet. That's our newest release. And on the right, you've got him cutting beets, which is part of our breeding process. The lab was started in 1949 by Warren Buck Gobbleman, and it's been continued today by Erwin. We've got a bunch of students working with us. Here we have a picture of Andre Alfaro. He's a PhD student, and he is working on carrot-shaped genetics. I talked about how planting density can affect shape, and that's true to an extent, but genetics also plays a huge role. You can see all of these different varieties have different shapes. You've got the ball, which is just a small ball, and you've got Nantes, which is more rounded carrot. We've also got different colors, and these are varieties that were released as open source varieties from the lab for people who were interested in perhaps using them for their own breeding projects or just for growing them. And they were released through the Open Source Seed Initiative, OSSI. And you can look into that, and if you're interested in such things. It's more of a research-based collective sharing, but if you're interested in growing these for seed, you're more than welcome to, and you can feel free to get in touch with me for that. We've also got 3 students working on beet disease resistance. I haven't really talked a whole lot about what diseases are actually affecting these root vegetables, but root vegetables and all vegetables in general have a real tough time dealing with disease. And the best way to combat that is not through sprays or pesticides, it's through good cultural practices and good genetics. By making varieties that don't get the diseases in the first place, you don't really have to worry about fighting the diseases, because once a plant has a disease, it's very difficult to get rid of it. Emily Galke, top left, works on bacterial leaf spot. Liam Dixon works on another foliar disease, and Kat Wigg works on a rhizoctonia disease, which affects the tuber or the actual root of beets. And then there's me, Adam. I work on flavor and eating quality, and that's what we're going to talk about here. Why beets? They're nutritious, they're low input, they got high market potential, and they're a minor crop right now. Only about 5,000 acres are grown in the country. A lot of them are grown here in Wisconsin, but a lot of them are also grown in home gardens because they're one of the few crops that really just does great in a home garden. They're packed full of vitamins and nutrients. And they're also packed full of something called geosmin. And you're probably actually familiar with this. It's the smell after it rains, or the smell of freshly dug earth. That's geosmin. It's a terpene. There's the molecular structure on the right. It's produced by Streptomyces bacteria in the soil, which is what's making that petrichor smell or the earth smell. But it's also produced by beets themselves. We measure that by grinding up the leaf tissue and using this machine, a GCMS, a gas chromatography mass spectrometer, to measure the amount of geosmin there. And we know that from previous grad students that different varieties of beets have different levels of geosmin, that the beets are actually making the geosmin, and that depending on how you grow it, that can affect how much geosmin the varieties have. That's one compound. The other compound we're really interested in is oxalic acid. And you probably have experience of this too. It's in spinach. There's the structure. It's got this really uncanny ability to absorb nutrients and bind to them. And the only issue is that when you eat that, the oxalic acid that's bound to the calcium also goes to your kidneys, and then it sort of lets go of the calcium, and that can contribute to kidney stone formation. It's also kind of an anti-nutritive thing. You'd have to eat a lot of beets to give yourself kidney stones. And it's not just beets. It's actually a lot of the best foods out there. Potatoes, raspberries, chocolate, tea, beans and nuts, spinach and Swiss chard. Those all have high oxalates. So there's been a movement to look for lower oxalic acid foods recently. And I think that's a good thing. And almost all the new varieties that we release from our program are low oxalic acid. And that's for another reason, which is you can't eat high oxalate foods raw. To some degree, they're usually processed because especially like boiling, because the heat and the water will help remove the oxalic acid from the fruit or vegetable, which makes it safe to eat. If you ate a high oxalic acid beet raw, I don't expect that you've bitten into one, but I have. It will burn the back of your throat, which is something that poses a serious impediment if you're trying to make a new type of beet, which we are. This is how we measure that compound. We're trying to make new beets that you can eat fresh. So the project that I'm working on goes to figure out when the beets are actually making the geosmin and oxalic acid through the growing season, how they're making it, what genes are responsible, and why they're making it, what purpose it serves. And all of that is eventually aimed towards finding ways to reduce it in our new beet varieties. What we want is we want beets that are sweet. We want the breed for them to have high sugar. We want them to be fun colors because people eat with their eyes, and we want them to have no burn. That way you can eat them fresh. You can see there's little sticks there. These are 4 new selections from our breeding program that you can just cut up and eat just like sticks. They're kind of like carrots. They're very sweet. They don't have that earthy flavor, and they have great colors. And I think they would just be an awesome addition to someone's lunchbox. Here's a tour of our breeding nursery and some upcoming releases. This is our Badger Flame that was released. You can buy seeds for that. They're running out quickly because it's very popular right now. I think there's still 1 or 2 companies that have seed available, and you have time to order that seed and plant it in your garden this year. It's a low oxalic acid, low geosmin, very sweet beet, cool colors. If you like all those traits but don't like the shape, you could consider going for the Badger Spark, which will be released soon. It's got almost all the same genetics, but it's got a round shape instead of that oblong shape. Other cool beet varieties, this is Sundrop. That's going to be a nice yellow-orange beet. It's incredibly round. It's beautiful to look at. Tastes great. You can eat it fresh, eat it raw. This is Dapple. Once again, going for that cool color, fresh eating beet, low geosmin, low oxalic acid. This is Coral. It's got a nice deep red color, which is kind of, well, it's a different sort of red, which is kind of unusual. And these are the next 5 are something that we've actually released, and people are working on increasing the seed. It'll be available for you to buy in a couple of years. We've got Moving Target, which is high geosmin, because some people do like that earthy flavor, myself included. And it's got a pink-purple color, and it's got those rings, kind of like a target. Blushing Not Bashful, bright white, high geosmin, has pink petioles, so it looks like it's blushing. The petioles are the bases of the leaves. Snow Globe is low geosmin, white flesh, nice small green leaves. The tops are good for eating there too, and it doesn't taste like earthy. Evansville Orbit has that target bullseye shape again, has high geosmin. And Evansville Ember is low geosmin with a nice, rich, scarlet red flesh. Maybe the Rutgers folks will like that. So feel free to follow along if you're interested in our breeding program and the projects we're working on and all the other research going on at UW. Please feel free to check out my YouTube channel, The Seed Scholar. I document all of our work in the field, all of our work in the lab. I try to make easily consumable videos. They're pretty short. So if you go and subscribe, you'll be able to follow along throughout our whole field season as we work on breeding carrots, onions, and beets and making them taste better, making them grow better, and making them better for the planet. And if you subscribe, it'll help the YouTube algorithm share my videos with more people. Plus, you'll be the first to know when I release new videos. And with that, I will open it up to questions. And thank you so much.
That was terrific. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with everyone. Angela, did you see any questions that we missed?
Any experience with carrot rust fly? Yeah, carrot rust fly.
So admittedly, carrot insect entomology is not my area of strength. We actually have a lot of issues with pests and diseases because some of the carrots that we breed are being grown on these giant carrot farms. It's actually outstanding how big some of these fields are, and diseases like that can really sweep through. So I don't have any personal experience with that, and I'm not sure if I can point you in the right direction, but I would say there's great resources from extension agents at Rutgers and all over the country for dealing with pests like that, and that might be regional too.
Great.
Adam, there was a question on overwintering root crops. Do you want to just cover which ones can be overwintered?
Sure. So it really depends on your winter. Out here, it's a little bit tougher to overwinter things. In New Jersey, there's still a range. Northern New Jersey gets pretty hard winters. In southern New Jersey, you can winter things over. And there's also a question of why you'd want to do that sometimes. If you were trying to get your carrots or your onions or your beets to flower so you could save seed, you could let those overwinter. A lot of these vegetables won't maintain their integrity or their edibility after they overwinter. Sometimes they'll get woody. Things that can overwinter are horseradish is a big one. Some of those perennial bunching onions that you're just eating the leaves, those are good to overwinter. Trying to think of other things we covered in this presentation. Those are the big ones that come to mind.
Garlic.
Yep, garlic can be overwintered. Some of those alliums that you're planting, if you plant them in the fall, they can overwinter and they'll sprout in the spring. That's a good way to do it too.
So what did the badger, how does that taste? Just give us like an overview of the flavor of that.
Yeah, the badger flame is a really cool beet. In my experience, about half the people don't like beets. And if you ask them why, they say it's because it tastes like dirt. And that makes sense because it's got that molecule of geosmin in it. So the badger flame doesn't have that earthy flavor. It's got a hint of your traditional beet flavor. So you know it's a beet, but it's not overpowering. Like if you've ever had a canned beet, you really get that beet flavor. And a lot of people like that. I like that flavor. But some people are not a fan of it. So this is really aiming to help expand the audience of people who can eat beets. So the badger flame is sweet. It is a very light flavor. We eat it fresh. You can slice it, put it in salads. You can also roast it, and it's still great roasted. But it really shines as a fresh eating vegetable. Sweet, no burn, cool colors. That's a win for me.
What is the best way or your favorite methods for cooking to maintain the flavor and also just give people the texture that they're used to?
For beets and for actually a lot of root vegetables, it seems like the best way to cook them is to roast them. Carrots are great roasted, beets, turnips, and rutabaga. Roasting them helps remove some of the moisture, so you get a nice texture to it. It breaks down some of those more pungent compounds. And I like to roast them with some olive oil. With beets, sometimes I'll put some rosemary or thyme, salt and pepper on them. And yeah, the low geosmin beets taste great roasted, and high geosmin beets taste pretty good too. Depends what you're looking for, but roasting is a good way to do it.
Adam, it sounds to me like these new the Badger Flame and Badger Spark would be ideal for small scale farmers as well in our area for their direct marketing operations. So how available are these right now?
Yeah, right now it seems like Badger Flame's the more available. It's in seed production. People are buying it by the packet. In the next few years, there's going to be some bigger seed companies that are going to be offering it because it's just hard to get a good quantity of seeds sometimes. It's got great potential for farmers markets because it looks so good, and it tastes good too. So you can give out samples of it, and really you can enter a whole new market of people into the beet market.
Adam, do you want to talk a little bit more about how you harvest beets and how you know when to harvest beets?
Yeah, it depends on what you're looking for. If you want young beets, they'll typically be sweeter. So you can just start harvesting them whenever the roots really start to swell and get round. Depending on the plant or the variety you plant, some of them are actually oblong beets, so round isn't necessarily a great way to describe that. In our program, we plant them in late May, early June, and we'll harvest them in August. And it seems like that's a pretty standard industry practice because they sort of grow until they hit each other and they stop growing or they might misshape a little bit. So just let it get nice and plump. Typically, the younger the better.
And in terms of harvesting, you're just using well, of course, a small gardener would use a garden fork, but do they use like a potato digger type device out there?
So the big farmers, they use a commercial beet harvester, and that there's two types. There's ones that pull it up from the bottom and ones that pull it from the top. But those are both doing the same thing that we do with our hands, which is either using a fork, like you said, or going ahead and just grabbing the tops and pulling, and they come out very easily, actually.
I want to thank everyone for joining us, and especially thank Adam D'Angelo for sharing a lot of wonderful information with all of our gardeners. And we look forward to seeing everyone next week on Are You Ready to Garden? Adam, have a great week. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Great. Thank you very much, and have a great evening, folks.
Take care.